When women received the vote in 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment, they were given the right to decide who would run our government. This begged the question, why not cast that vote to elect a woman? Today, the idea of a woman running for Congress or the Senate is not unusual, but in 1920 it was a radical concept. And for the pioneer generation of women in politics, oftentimes the path into office was through their deceased husbands. When a governor, congressman, or senator died in office, it was not uncommon for the wife to be appointed to fill out the remainder of the term. This was done under the guise of a courtesy to the deceased. But the real intent was to put a neutral party into the office who would not rock the boat, and more importantly, not seek actual election when the term was up. In the first 60 years after receiving the vote, 11 of the 14 women to serve in the U.S. Senate were appointed to their positions in this way. And only one of those women, Hattie Caraway, went on to run and win 2 full terms in her own right. So it's no surprise that some of the first women to harness and use political power, in fact, were not elected officials. And a little more than 10 years after women got the vote, one independent, spirited woman became an agent of change in America.
The first woman superstar of politics was not an elected official. She was, in fact, the first lady of our country at the time, and that was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was instrumental under the construction of the New Deal for championing the rights of women, establishing youth programs, programs for workers, and other social service programs. She wasn't always the most popular person around, but she is known by some historians as the conscience of the New Deal.
I was brought up with my father speaking a lot about FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt as well. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was one of my mother's heroines, a Mexican lady who was an immigrant here. But she thought she was a role model for all women, and she saw her as the quintessential American heroine. And I've come to view her in that way as well.
In the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement became another way non-elected women became politically engaged. But they were more often than not kept out of the spotlight. One of the chief organizers of the March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech, was Dr. Dorothy Height.
It was Dorothy Height, who was the head of the National Council of Negro Women, who pulled that march together. The men in the movement were strategizing and fighting as to which one would get the most publicity, who would lead. And that march was about to come apart until Dorothy Height said, "All of you keep quiet. This is the way it's going to happen." They were taken back. But she was right, because there was that fight between the men who were known as leaders and this young upstart, Martin Luther King, who was coming in and trying to take over. It was that kind of battle that was going on, which was about to sink this fantastic event, until Dorothy Height said, "No, it will be this way."
The decision was made that Dr. Height would not speak, but we know the very important role that she played when those doors were closed in those back rooms, when policies and direction was set, that she played an important role in getting the men to be able to communicate to each other, to be able to take someone aside and have those sidebar conversations that brought everything together.
On June 13, 1963, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was assassinated on the driveway in front of his home. His wife, Myrlie, was suddenly catapulted into a more active role in the civil rights movement. She would eventually go on to become the first female president of the NAACP. But the role of a woman in a leadership position did not come easily.
We were always the supporters of the men. And by that I mean that we allowed them to be in the forefront and to carry the battle. But if you really go behind the scenes, the women played the role of the masters of strategy and technique, of giving the support sometimes when it wasn't deserved. But our men must be up front, they must be respected, they must be supported, of not taking on titles, but being sure that it's passed on to the males, even if they were young.
While the civil rights movement was raging across the country, Mexican Americans were organizing the National Farmers Workers Association in California. Most associate the movement with Cesar Chavez, but the association had two co-founders. The other was a single mother of 7. Her name was Dolores Huerta. She recalled what it was like being oftentimes the only woman in the closed-door meetings of the National Farmers Workers Association.
I got kind of sick of the sexist statements that the men were making, so one day I just took out my pencil and paper, and every time any of the board members made a sexist statement, I just put a little notch on my paper. And so at the end of the meeting, Cesar would always say, does anybody have anything they want to add or talk about? And during the meeting, I said, yes. I said, I just want to point out that during the course of this meeting, you gentlemen here have made 58 sexist statements. And they were all shocked. And then, of course, I did that for the subsequent meetings, and we got them down to 20, and we got them down to 10, and pretty soon we got them down to 5, and pretty soon people tell me that they would all get together before they came into the meeting. Okay, everybody, no sexist statements in this meeting.
Around this same time, women began to have a presence in the lower house of Congress. And in the 1972 presidential primaries, a congresswoman became the first female to run for the highest office in the land. Her name was Shirley Chisholm.
I feel that when you look at someone who's resilient and absolutely uncompromising, Shirley Chisholm models that. Her philosophy of being unbought and unbossed. When you look at all the things, the obstacles she had to traverse to be, for example, she was excluded from participating originally in the major debates. But it was not until she forced the issue, she would show up and force the issue. So she did not just allow herself to be relegated to a second-class citizen.
Throughout the 70s and 80s, women's presence in federal government was slowly rising. In 1984, Congresswoman Geraldine Ferrero became the first female vice presidential candidate representing a major American political party. But it was the 1992 national elections where women made a big step forward. It was dubbed the Year of the Woman. As many as 60 million women went to the polls to vote. Their impact was felt immediately. After the ballots were counted, 24 new women had been elected to the House of Representatives, along with 5 new female senators, the largest increase of women political leaders in American history.
I came in the Year of the Woman in 1992, and women in Congress were still marginalized.
Lucille Roybal Allard was the first Mexican-American woman elected to Congress. She remembers the obstacles women still faced over 70 years after they had gotten the vote.
We were not included in key meetings, put on task force, even task force that had to do what is traditionally known as women's issues like welfare reform and issues dealing with children. And we had to fight our own leadership and assert ourselves to be a part of those discussions and a part of those negotiations. Things have changed since then tremendously. But as hard as it was when we came here in '92, I think it's important for our young people to understand that there were many pioneer women before us, and people like Shirley Chisholm and others really helped pave the way for us, and it was much harder for them.
The momentum started with the Year of the Woman, continued into the next year as another new senator took her seat beside the others. She made history by becoming the first female senator from Texas.
Well, it is so different today, and it's wonderful that it's different today. When I was growing up, of course, no one would have encouraged a girl to run for public office or even aspire to be a congresswoman or a senator or a governor. And so really, we were just having things in ourselves that said, I can do this.
Kay Bailey Hutchinson was born July 22, 1943, and was raised in Lamarck, Texas. The world of the 40s and 50s expected women to fulfill the traditional roles of wife and homemaker. But Senator Hutchinson broke the mold when she graduated from college and decided to attend law school and eventually enter politics. Once in the Senate, Hutchinson and some of her colleagues decided to meet regularly to discuss the unique hurdles they faced together as women.
And it was so interesting because even though we're all diverse, we all have different views, we represent very different states, but we do have a common experience of having been discriminated against, having had a harder time getting where we are, and even experiences of not having the family support system and having to deal with the issues of being in Washington and also being at home and having to keep everything together. Because I can't go to one of my male colleagues and say, what are the best schools in the Washington area? Where would you find daycare? Where would you get a housekeeper, and someone to help you with your children? A man would look at me and say, what? Well, call my wife. And yet all of us women in the Senate have had these experiences, and we share them.
Even today, in a progressive metropolis like Los Angeles, women are still underrepresented.
Our city of Los Angeles is about 230 years old, and I'm only the second African-American woman to have ever been elected to the city council.
Jan Perry is only one of 2 women out of 15 on the LA City Council. She believes, however, that their presence is important.
I think women bring a different perspective to politics and the political process because, many of us, we have families, we have other things we have to balance in our lives. We're often the center of a community, the center of a family, incredible multitaskers, because that's the nature of what a woman has to be in our society. And the ability to overcome great challenges. I think women are more collaborative in their thinking. I think that they're more oriented towards solving problems as opposed to winning for winning's sake. A guy will get up one day and, he has opinions. He'll say, you know what, I'm going to run for the United States Senate. And they do. Sometimes they win, and it's kind of amazing. I don't know that a lot of women think that way. Maybe we should.
90 years after getting the vote, women are still struggling for equality in the political arena. But every obstacle brings an opportunity to demonstrate the strength and courage of American female politicians. Women governors, senators, cabinet members, and Supreme Court justices, determined to prove they are second to none.